It's gonna be really hard to review this. There's so many turns. This left? Huh?
Located just an hour and a half east of Seattle on I-90, the Teanaway Community Forest resides just over the hill from Roslyn, Washington. Most people driving to this area from Seattle probably have RatPac and the other trails descending south toward Roslyn on their itinerary, but there are trails in the valley on the north side of that ridge. There's even Sandstone and hoodoos over here. You should really check it out. I was introduced to the Teanaway Community Forest back in 2019 at the May in the Way event organized by Bob Bernique, a member of the Evergreen Mountain Bike Alliance. This is quintessential open ponderosa pine forest riding with varied spots of thicker vegetation near the creeks with sandy to silty tread that gets very dusty when it's dry. There are a lot of different routes of various lengths and difficulties in this forest, but the 14-mile one sandwich ride with 1,800 feet of elevation gain that I followed along on started here at the Teanaway Campground, a nicely maintained DNR campsite very close to the trail system. Before we go on, if you'd like to support informational content like this, please navigate to patreon.com/voiceovertrails at the end of this video and sign up today. The Teanaway Community Forest doesn't so much contain a trail system as it does a network of trails connected by logging roads. But a lot of those logging roads are gated, so vehicle traffic isn't really a serious issue. Keep in mind that equestrians utilize this area as well. It's Central Washington, after all. The equestrians riding out here get more opportunities to ride and therefore properly train their horses, so they are typically more experienced, skilled, and consequently much more laid back and agreeable than the folks you'll encounter riding horses on the expensive and crowded wet side of the mountains. They're having too much fun to give you dirty looks. Just be courteous, talk nicely to the horses, and step out of the way when appropriate. When we got out to the paved section of the West Fork Teanaway Road, we proceeded left, crossed the bridge, and then turned right onto this random piece of unnamed single track that parallels the road on the north side. Then we got to this end of the trail at a barbed wire fence and proceeded left to the other side of the gate, and then headed up the hill on the Carlson Canyon access road, which was a relatively steep but not entirely soul-crushing climb up the hill. We then took the Carlson Tie Trail to this intersection with a little snippet of old road that leads to Illahee Road. Illahee Road seems to be an abandoned or decommissioned logging road that is reverting to single track as vegetation encroaches from the sides. At least it's getting grown over down here near the creek. After this water crossing, the forest does start to open up again and things start getting a little bit higher and drier as the road gains in elevation. And this trail/road thing kind of can't decide if it's a trail or a road as it switches back and forth between single and double track. None of this is indicated on Trail Forks or appears to be a part of any Trail Forks route. Community trail systems like this are really hard to document, and this is no exception, being full of strange turns and varying landscapes to the point that it would take an intimate, localized knowledge of the place to really know where you're at or what you're doing. Eventually, the road did take us to an exposure, so that was nice. It was the first exposure of the ride, and this was after a lot of confusing snippets of road and single track through unremarkable working forest. 4.5 miles into this ride, the road joins up with the Windy Ridge Trail, which starts off going downhill, and that was a very welcome change of pace, but it wasn't too long before we had to stop off for a little off-trail exploration. Right near the beginning of the Windy Ridge Trail, right before it gets good, there's a little side trail to a cave called the Indian Cave. This is also where the weirdness of Central Washington geology becomes obvious because this sandstone cave seems kind of out of place for the Pacific Northwest. From the cave, the trail grudgingly gives you about 2 or 3 minutes of decent but mostly unremarkable downhill on very smooth, dusty mineral soil through Central Washington Forest before it ends at what was, near the end of May, a very swampy creek crossing. We had to get clever and work as a team to get across this one without anyone slipping in the mud. This probably dries out later in the summer. And from there, we turned left on Rabbit Gulch Road for another couple of miles with a few hundred feet of climbing. I was sure glad I wasn't here during the hottest part of summer because there's a lot of sun exposure out here. Speaking of exposure, there's also something very unexpected here, and that's exposed sandstone. It's not granite, it's not basalt, it's sandstone, just like the stuff in Moab or other parts of the desert Southwest. But it's up here in Central Washington, just hanging out among the volcanoes. There's kind of a big old mixed up swirl in the Earth's crust that centers around Snoqualmie Pass, and this area is part of it, and that leads to some wacky geology, including rock formations in places you wouldn't expect to see them. The sandstone formations are found along the River Ridge Trail, and seriously, this sandstone rides just like slick rock because it is essentially the same thing. These are the baby rock rolls. I believe there are more intensive rock slabs in another part of this forest, but that wasn't the main objective of this ride. The River Ridge Trail is mostly downhill, but it is a ridge trail, so there are some short and punchy climbs with kind of a flat interlude in the middle. It's all pretty standard middle of Washington stuff, and there's nothing you wouldn't expect from riding through a butterscotch-scented ponderosa forest. There are a few decent rock slabs in here. It's clear the ponderosa also finds the sandstone to be a bit of a challenge in this climate, but it is making do. Then there's a punchy climb right before the trail gets ridiculously steep, but I don't have video of the rest of the descent because my GoPro battery died. But the steep and very loose descent drops you off here at the Teanaway River. You're not going to cross the river though, so don't worry, you won't need a horse to keep your feet dry. As you head up the trail, called Surveyor, there's this old sheep herder's cabin from the early 20th century. That's one of the things that's just hiding out in this forest. We were surprised at how far it is from the water. Seems like an awful lot of work unless there was a spring nearby that we didn't know about. From the sheep herder cabin, we continued up Surveyor, where we ended up having to cross a little bit of water and then riding more single track until we got to Rabbit Gulch Road, where we turned left. Rabbit Gulch Road composes the last major climb on this route. Rabbit Gulch is a road. It's a steep road. It does steep road things for a mile or two until it has a short downhill and then some more climbing before we took a sharp left to get back onto Illahee Road for a little bit, and then we found TCF, which is mostly downhill back to the beginning of the ride. But what's cool about it is that there's hoodoos. Well, they're kind of hoodoos. I forgot to get GoPro footage of the more classic looking formations for whatever reason. Hoodoos are just weathered piles of sandstone, but I always thought they were only a desert Southwest thing, but here they are, chunks of weathered sandstone in the middle of the forest in the Pacific Northwest, where it just doesn't seem like they belong. They feel so out of place here. TCF kind of wanders along the ridge for a while before it finally turns into another very nice but entirely unremarkable downhill jaunt through some lovely ponderosa forest along the ridge overlooking the Teanaway River. The soil is loose and sandy. It's single track. It's all fine. It's just fine. It'll eventually dump you back out at the bottom near the campground. I'd like to take this moment to thank all my Patreon supporters, especially my Low Me Goodness level sponsors, Andy Suri, Charles Kim, Damon Corey, and Randy Relithford. I'd also like to thank my Hero Dirt level sponsors, earning their special mention at the end of this video, Bryce Ulrich, Edward Lanton, Heather von Valkenburg, Jason Moore, and Pedro Cantarini. If you'd like to join this list of sponsors, navigate to patreon.com/voiceovertrails and become a patron. Now, get out there and go ride your bike.